All right, here we are, machine learning session 6. We're moving right along here. Today, we're going to talk about unsupervised learning. And at the end, we're going to touch on a very particular algorithm which within unsupervised learning, which is k-means clustering. So unsupervised learning is when we have a data set that is unlabeled. So we have a bunch of data points just floating about in our, when we plot this on their coordinates of their features, but we don't necessarily know what types of groupings that they belong to. There are no, there's no structure within the labeled output that we are trying to predict. So our goal is to identify that structure or to identify those patterns or relationships within the data. Here you see on the right, we have unsupervised learning, where we have a series of points, and we decide in this case that there are 3 groupings or 3 clusters. And we create boundaries that define those clusters and define those groupings, and assign those points to those boundaries. Where in supervised learning, the difference is we have labels applied to these. So we know that these are green stars, and we're trying to train an algorithm to identify green stars or blue X's and red dots. Whereas in this algorithm, nobody's telling us that they are green stars or that they are blue X's. We just have to define some type of grouping of these elements that makes sense and is meaningful for whatever problem we're trying to solve. So orienting back on this image that we talked about in the first class, you can probably answer some of these or have a better understanding for some of the context around this supervised learning branch. So far, we've talked about supervised learning, we've talked about classification, and we've talked about regression. We've spoken to decision trees and random forests, and we've touched on neural networks, and we've talked about linear regression and logistic regression. So you understand more of these concepts on this side. Today, we're going to talk about unsupervised learning. And clustering is the application that we'll focus on, and we'll focus on k-means clustering as an algorithm to understand. But there are a couple other subdomains within unsupervised learning. And one is clustering, and that's kind of the application that we've been talking about. We have a data set, and we want to create groups of things that are similar to each other. So you've got a lot of beers, and you want to group beers together that are similar to other beers. So maybe you can recommend them to someone. Dimensionality reduction, on the other hand, is taking a large set of features and reducing them to a smaller representation. So if you have 1,000 features, how do we take that representation of those features and reduce them to a smaller amount that still captures the meaning within those features, but is a smaller representation that's either more manageable or more applicable, or maybe we can visualize it in some way that we couldn't the 10,000 features. And the other one is association, which is identifying relationships and dependencies between variables and large data sets. This one we won't talk about today. We'll just focus on clustering, and we'll touch on dimensionality reduction. Contrasting supervised to unsupervised learning just one more time. This requires labeled data when we're speaking about supervised learning. So we know what we are trying to predict. We know that we're trying to predict that someone will respond to this emailing campaign or they won't respond to this emailing campaign. We have an outcome. We want to predict the value of this house, and we know the value of past houses similar to this one, which have been sold. Unsupervised learning would be, I have a series of customers. I would like you to tell me groups of customers that are similar to each other. I don't really know in what ways they are similar to each other. I don't have any predefined notion about how they should be categorized, but I have a lot of information about my customers, and I want you to take all of that information in these n dimensions and create groups of people that are similar to each other. Or in the housing application, I have a lot of houses, and I just want to understand houses that are similar to each other. I want you to group these houses in ways that are similar, but I don't have some predefined notion about how that should be. The great thing about supervised learning is we have a way of getting feedback. So we know when we predict the value of a house, when we are wrong about that, and how far off we are. Because when the house eventually sells, we can say, hey, this is how much it actually sold for, and this is how correct or incorrect we were. Unsupervised learning is not quite as defined or as structured as that. Since we don't know what the ground truth reality is in the first place, the ways that we measure that are less tangible. We might have to measure things like, how tightly coupled is this cluster that we created? How far is this cluster from other clusters? Is it well separated? So there are different ways in unsupervised learning that we have to think about determining if our approach was good or not. Okay. One of the most challenging parts of this, I think, that we'll find is we don't really know how many classes that we want to classify something into, unless you have some strong background in your domain knowledge or some strong reasoning of the types of classes you want to classify it into. It can be hard to decide if you want 2 groups or 3 groups or 5 groups. And in this picture, it's obvious, we can say, oh, visually, we can just group into 2 groups here. But as we get into larger and larger sets of dimensions, as we have more features and the dimensionality of our data set grows, it can be even more difficult to pick that out and to determine that. So we'll talk about some numerical ways of measuring the quality of clustering for k-means clustering. So what is clustering? It's the task of organizing a data set into groups based on their similarity. And we can see in this picture here on the right, there's maybe not very clear, it's maybe not very clear that this should certainly be separated into 3 groups. An argument could perhaps be made for 2 groups, maybe this tighter cluster here, and maybe this larger segment here, or perhaps 4 groups. So this is what we mean by unsupervised learning. This is what the data looks like before we've clustered it. They're represented by some features. Maybe this is, we're talking about dogs, and maybe this is like height and weight, and we want to create groups of dogs that are similar to each other. This is what it would look like after we create these clusters. So we would say there is cluster 1 here in red, and this cluster is just groups of dogs that are similar to each other by height and weight. And this blue cluster here are groups of dogs that are similar to each other by height and weight. We could continue to add attributes here to make these clusters more defined. There are several different clustering algorithms. A couple of really common ones are k-means clustering, hierarchical clustering, and dbSCAN. In k-means clustering, this is the one that we're going to go through today in depth and in detail. It's a very widely used algorithm, and it's a great one for introduction to machine learning, because I think the steps are very easy to follow and kind of reason with and grasp and work with. And there's also a lot of additions and extensions onto k-means clustering that people have come up with to make it more robust. Essentially what it is we have a lot of data and we pick some random points on that data plane, and then we assign, and those become our centers of our centroids, and we assign data points to the nearest centroid. We see which one's closest, and we assign the point to that. And then we find the center and we go through that iteratively. So the end result of k-means clustering is it makes, because it uses nearest distance to a centroid, nearest distance to a point on that plane, it ends up making clusters that are very round. And so if you look at this picture here, for example, where we clearly have points that us visually as humans can look at this and say, well, this is class 1 and this is class 2. K-means clustering is actually not capable of differentiating between these well, because it makes very circular assignments. So all of the assignments are nearest distance to the centroid, which will always be a radius out. And so for that reason, there's other algorithms, such as dbScan, this density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise, that really assigns points based on density. So this is dbScan, and you can see that this type of grouping performs a lot better for whatever definition of better we define for this problem set. But visually, it seems that this cluster representation is slightly better than this cluster representation, or I'm sorry, than this cluster representation. So this is to say that choosing your algorithm can make a big difference for your problem. So that's the importance of first understanding how these algorithms work, but also second, understanding your data, understanding the problem that you're working with, and trying to figure out what's the right algorithm to apply for that problem set. Hierarchical clustering, I don't have a picture of this here, but it groups clusters together, either from bottom up or top down in a hierarchy. And this is used quite a bit in like bioinformatics when we're trying to group together species or group together DNA samples to create clusters of similar animals, for example, or clusters of similar beings based on DNA. So hierarchical clustering is a really common application. Dimensionality reduction is another class of unsupervised learning problems. And dimensionality reduction takes usually a large set of features. For explanation reasons, in this picture, we're only looking at XYZ, so it's a three-dimensional plane. But it takes a large set of features, which means high dimensionality, because each time you add a feature, you're adding another dimension. In this case, we have 3 dimensions. We have X dimension, Z dimension, and Y dimension. But imagine if we added a 4th dimension, how hard that gets to visualize, or a 5th dimension, or a 6th dimension. And there are times when we want to work with a smaller set, because maybe we either don't need all of that information. A lot of it is noise and it's not really adding value to our prediction. So maybe we want to reduce all of the data to a smaller dimension set so that we can get the highest quality of information in the smallest representation possible. And then maybe other times we want to just reduce the dimensionality because it's easier to work with, because it takes us a long time to load all of that data. And while maybe our model would perform better with all of that information, it's just a lot of overhead on the system, and it reduces our response time and the amount of time it takes to run the computation and produce a result. And so we want to create a smaller representation of that same data that still captures the meaningful moments and meaningful parts. So let's look at this picture first real quick. So we have here on the right some three-dimensional objects here. And if we did some dimensionality reduction on these objects, what they might look like in these two-dimensional planes is we broadcast two features of these, two components of these to two-dimensional planes. One component might be, hey, we looked at it from the top, we sliced off the top, and this is what it might look like from the top. We have two circles here that represents some variability or some component of this information here. And another slice that might represent some component of this information are these two lines here that are representing the direction that this data is going. And so we have two pieces of information that are clearly, we've lost some information during this transformation, but we captured really the important, the important elements that are maybe relevant as we put this into a model to try to make a prediction about this, predict perhaps the type of the shape. We might just need this information. We don't need all of these points and every single little point on here that makes up these objects. So that is dimensionality reduction. When I was first learning about this, somebody once described this to me as, imagine you have a picture of somebody's head, but you're not capable of visualizing that in 3D because maybe it's in many, many dimensions and we as humans can't computationally understand that. And so what you do instead is you take a picture of the top of the head, and you take a picture of the side of the head, and you take a picture like looking up at the head and from the other side and from behind the head. And so that is sort of what these dimensionality, when we try to plot these components, what they're representing and the visual that we might see from them, because it does become hard when we can't really understand 100 dimensions. So we can't really visualize this picture on the left in real application. So all we're given are these pictures on the right after we reduce to components, and we're trying to plot them on two-dimensional planes and understand, well, what is this component Y and X and Y and Z really look like, and what does that mean about these clusters if we group them into clusters afterwards. And so that's kind of the pain point or the struggle with dimensionality reduction, is the interpretability and the visualization. It can be hard to imagine an entire head if you only have kind of slices here and there. So dimensionality, there's a lot of dimensionality reduction algorithms, and they are very relevant, especially in today's field of neural networks and large language models and autoencoders. So this is definitely a very valuable thing to learn about. I don't know that we have time quite in this introduction course to dive into the details of it, but here's kind of the steps of principal component analysis, I guess, in a nutshell. And so the main ones, I guess, that are most popular that I see quite a bit are principal component analysis, which is a dimensionality reduction technique that is usually used to create those components that I was talking about, those principal components that represent some variance in the data without all of the noise that's also wrapped into that. So it represents just the most meaningful components or pieces of that observation that differentiate it from another observation. So it takes all these larger dimensions, but puts them in a smaller dimensional space for us to use. T-SNE is used quite a bit, nonlinear technique for reducing dimensions, and autoencoders. So if we have a lot of, if we have a bunch of customers that exist at our company, and maybe there's a lot of history that these customers have with us. They've made phone calls over time, and they've interacted with the call center. They've sent us letters in the mail. They've sent us emails. That's a lot of information. Potentially, it's definitely thousands, potentially millions of records of information for each and every individual. And they can be of varying lengths. So one individual might have, a very short period of history with us, and another individual might have a very long period of history with us. And so how do we take that type of information and enter that into a model? We can take all of that and we can kind of compress that information through an autoencoder, and we can put it into a lower dimensional space and extract something called a latent representation. And that can be a feature that we then input into modeling to predict something like customer churn, for example. Is this customer going to stay with us or going to leave with us? And one important feature of that could be this latent representation of their history with us, their phone calls and interactions. So we've talked about a couple of real world applications, but this was a reminder slide to me to talk about a few others. So we spoke to a grouping of customers based on purchasing behavior and demographics. We didn't quite talk about anomaly detection yet. So if we don't necessarily know what fraud looks like in our data set, we want to detect fraud. It can be hard to identify fraud if you've never identified fraud before. You have no labels for your data set. So how do you detect people who potentially may be committing fraud? You could use an unsupervised learning technique to identify individuals that look very, very different from your typical population, to find a group or a cluster of individuals that just look different based on these features. And then after you go into and identify those features, maybe you see that they're unusually high request amounts given, this other information about them, or just the activity that they did was very suspicious. It was unusual and different in the pattern that occurred compared to our other customers. Data compression. So one of the most interesting applications of data compression, I think, is in the domain of images. So images are made up of a series of pixels. So we have an image, and you can kind of like cut it into a variety of squares, and each square represents maybe a coloring, and maybe it could be one of 1,000 different color values, everything shading from like pink to gray to orange to all these different values. Well, that can take up a lot of room. Having a high quality image like that can be computationally intensive to put through a machine learning model and to process and apply computation to. So one thing that we can do is we can actually take each of those color values and we can map them to a smaller set of color values. So maybe we just want them to be red, green, blue color values. We can take those colors and map them to a smaller set. So the image loses some vibrance. It's not quite as sharp or defined in its colors. We could even just map them to black or white, for example, 1 or 0, or some grayscale values, in order to reduce the amount of information being represented in those images. In today's world of natural language processing, we can do topic modeling over documents. So if we are creating a chatbot to work with or to respond to an individual when they ask a question of a lot of series of documents that we have, we can apply topic modeling. So we can say, hey, what is the type of question that this individual might be asking, and what are some topics within my documents that might be of similarity to what they are asking. There's a couple of pros and cons to using unsupervised learning. It really is a pro that you don't have labeled data, because you can just don't have to go through and label all of this data or go through an exercise of trying to find ways to create those labels. You can just leverage these algorithms to create those labels for you, the clusters that are essentially those hidden patterns and structure within the data. The downside of not having labels, though, is that it makes evaluation more difficult. So we can't say, hey, we were incorrect in predicting this as cluster 1, or we incorrectly created our clusters or assignment of these data points, because we don't really have a ground truth to tell us when we were wrong or correct in terms of labeling the data. But unsupervised learning can really reduce the dimensionality of your data, and it can enable you to use very large data sets with a smaller dimension on them as input into another supervised learning method. Okay, let's talk about k-means clustering. Let me check the chat real quick, just see if there's questions so far. Okay. K-means clustering is a very specific algorithm in unsupervised learning. And k-means clustering creates k distinct groups. So in this case, k represents the number of clusters. In this example, you can see that we have 6 clusters here, zero-based index, so we actually have 6 clusters, and k would represent these 6 clusters. If I spun this image, you would see a pink cluster there in the back. The goal of k-means clustering is to define what these clusters are, where each data point is assigned, and to which centroid or which cluster it's assigned to. So the goal of k-means clustering is to actually create this coloring that you see in this picture. So it defines the boundaries that decide this is a green data point, this is an orange data point, this is a blue data point. We're going to reference this picture multiple times, but these are the steps of k-means clustering. So this is how k-means clustering works. Step 1 is initialization. First, we have to choose how many clusters we want to have. So we randomly initialize k centroids. In this case, we have picture A, where we have all of our data. And then picture B, we've initialized 2 centroids, a red one and a blue one. Then we have to assign data points. So each data point is assigned to the nearest centroid, in this case, based on Euclidean distance. Excuse me. So our points here, these blue points, are based on Euclidean distance closer to this blue X. Then we're going to update the centroids. And that just means we're going to move these centroids to the new center of the cluster. So we take all these data points and we add them together. And then we divide them by the number of data points in the cluster. And we move this X to the center. Finally, we're going to repeat those steps until we see convergence. So after we move these X's to the center, we actually reassign our data points again. And what happens when we reassign those is you can see this little blue data point down here. It's actually much closer to the red X over here than it is to the blue X now that we have updated the centroids to be at the center of these colored clusters. And this other blue dot is much closer to this red X. And you can see there's some red points up here that are now closer to the blue X. And so we reassign these points to their new centroid that they're closest to. And then we update the centroid again, which means we calculate the center of all of these points. We add all these points together, divide them by the number of points, and we update that as a new centroid. And we do that for the red one as well. We continue this process until convergence, which essentially means until the centroids no longer change. We're going to walk through this in detail here in just a moment. In k-means clustering, so initialization, the thing to remember about initialization is that it is a random process. And so we are truly just selecting where these points begin randomly. So in this case, we selected it here. We could have selected it in the center of these two. We could have selected them right next to each other in the upper left-hand corner. And you can imagine by the fact that this is an iterative process, we're moving these, we're finding the center, we're reassigning points, we're moving again, finding the center, reassigning the points, that where we start really matters because it can change how long the algorithm takes. And if I run k-means clustering on my computer and you run k-means clustering on your computer, and we don't have a random seed, so our points get assigned differently, we probably will have very different outcomes, and we will have different clusters that get created. So if you want reproducibility and repeatability in your code, having a random seed is something that's very essential to k-means clustering. It's very, very heavily influenced by the starting point of these centroids. Another piece to consider here in the k-means clustering algorithm is that we, of course, define 2 here, but the algorithm itself does not tell us to define 2 points. That's something that we had to define as the programmers. And so there's a question of, well, how did you choose 2? And how do we figure out what the right number of Ks are, the right number of clusters for our algorithm for k-means clustering? And we'll talk about that at the end. So initialization, randomly choosing, that's step 1, is randomly choosing where those points start. When we say assign data points, when we say a data point is a member of cluster 1 for this loop or iteration, or a member of cluster 2 for this loop or iteration, one way that we can do that is with Euclidean distance. And if you guys remember from your high school math classes, Euclidean distance is the formula here where we are taking the square root of the x value of the data point that we're looking at, the x value of the centroid, and we're squaring that. And then to that, we are adding the square of the y value of the data point that we're looking at and the y value of the centroid. And you can imagine this is just with 2 dimensions. If we had 2 features, we're looking at dogs and we have height and weight. However, you can imagine if we had n features that you would just continue that process iteratively. So a more generalized formula for this would just be the sum over all of the features, where you're taking the value for the feature that you have and the value positionally for that centroid, you're subtracting that, and then you're squaring that. And adding those together and taking the square root. So this is Euclidean distance. This is not the only value, distance metric that you can use within k-means clustering. There are a series of other distance metrics that you can use within k-means clustering. This is kind of one of those points in machine learning and implementing your algorithms where you're going to have to make a choice. You're going to have to understand, dig into your data, understand how it's being represented, understand the problem that you're trying to solve, and whether Euclidean distance makes sense, or whether a different method or approach would make more sense. The next step, we're going to assign the data points. So here we went through step 1, where we have our data. we already made our centroids and we're assigning the data points. So in this case, it's just the nearest cluster based on the distance. We're going to use the Euclidean distance. So let's, if we were in person today, I would have us walk through this problem. If you are watching this recording, maybe just pause here for a moment and see if you can solve this, this quick little problem here. It should take you just a moment. So we have centroid 1, which is at position 2, 3. We have centroid 2, which is at position 5, 7. And I'm asking you to identify which centroid at this point in time this point belongs to. Should it be in cluster 1 or cluster 2 based on Euclidean distance? So go ahead and pause and try and solve that. And we will move on here. So the answer is here. And you guys can pause. You can look at this and work through this here. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that Euclidean distance may not be the right metric. It's really sensitive to scale. So if your features have very different minimum and maximum values in them, it may not be applicable. So imagine you're looking at a house. A house has square footage and it has a number of bedrooms, and those are on very different levels of scale. We see much larger numbers on average for square footage than we would for number of bedrooms in a house. So if we don't scale those down to be on the same level, then Euclidean distance might give more weight to some features than others by nature of the algorithm. So scaling or doing normalization, which we're going to talk about machine learning methodology next class, is applicable, is usually recommended if you're going to use Euclidean distance. So it may not be suitable for all implementations, but there's other metrics that you can use in your implementation in sklearn. There's Manhattan distance and cosine similarity and others. So the next point, we've defined our initial random centroids. We've assigned all of our points and said, yep, first for our first iteration of this, these points belong to this centroid. Now it's time to update the centroids. So when we update the centroids, this is where we take all of the data points in our data set and calculate the distance to each centroid. So for each centroid that exists in our data set, we calculate the distance of all the points to that, or for each point, we calculate the distance to all the centroids, and then we recalculate the mean of the centroid. And we reassign it to a different value. So suppose we had a cluster with 3 data points, and these are our 3 data points. These are our new data points that we've assigned to our cluster. Now we have to update our centroid value. So we have to change, we have to move our centroid to be at the center of these 3 points. We want it to be centrally located. Pause here for a moment, see if you can solve this and determine the new centroid value. And here's our new centroid value. So this is the new position. We just average those points. Okay, after we have determined our new centroid position, we go through this entire process again. So we assign all of the points to the nearest cluster, because the cluster that they are nearest to is going to change since we just changed the centroid location. And then we update the centroids by calculating the average location of all the new points that have been assigned to that centroid. We do that over and over again until we hit some type of stopping criteria for our algorithm. And until we converge, our algorithm converges, And convergence can be defined in a couple of ways. Either the centroids are stopping criteria, or either the centroids do not move. So the position of the centroid, we calculate, we assign all the points, and we calculate the center, and it's the same. So we don't move it, then it's stabilized. Or the cluster assignments remain the same. So we update the points, but the data points really don't change between the iterations. And the third option is perhaps we set another maximum of iterations. So the centroids keep moving and keep shifting, maybe back and forth between two options. And we say, hey, after 1,000 iterations, stop running. Our algorithm, in fact, did not converge. It just hit our stopping criteria of maximum iterations. Okay, so now we can understand this picture just a little bit better. We have step 1, right? Step 0, we have all of our data on picture A. In picture B, we have initialization, where we randomly place 2K centroids. We assign our data points close to the closest centroid. In this case, these data points get assigned to blue. These data points get assigned to red. We update the centroids to be the center of those clusters. So we moved our centroids here, and then we reassign the points, recalculate the assignment for the points. So these points are clearly blue now. These are clearly red. We update the center of our clusters. We updated them to be here, and then we reassign the points. No change happened in the reassignment of the points. None of the red points changed to blue points, or blue points changed to red from E to F. So we hit our stopping criteria, and we no longer need to repeat the algorithm. One of the challenges that I mentioned earlier can be choosing the number of clusters. So how do you determine the right number of K, the right K clusters? Should K be equal to 2? Should K be equal to 20? Should K be equal to 100? We'll go through the elbow method, which is a way of running the algorithm over many iterations of K, and then using a graph to try to optimally select the number of clusters. It's not as concrete of a selection criteria as some of our supervised learning techniques, but this is one way of evaluating the quality of your clusters. We'll also talk about the silhouette score, which measures how well each data point is within a cluster. In reality, it's often helpful to work with your stakeholders or implementation that you're trying to build and really understand the domain knowledge to try to conceptualize if the number of clusters that you've determined, if the K value that you've created for your algorithm actually makes sense in that implementation. Okay, so here is the elbow method, and you can see why they call it the elbow method here, because this looks like a elbow, and this, of course, would be the optimal choice in that scenario. So it helps us determine the optimal K by looking at the sum of squared distance between the data points within their assigned cluster. So you look at all the points in the data within a given cluster, and you calculate the squared distance of that data point to all of the other data points within that cluster. You take the average of that, and that's your within cluster sum of squares. So this is the value that we are plotting, the within cluster sum of squares. And you can see that our within cluster sum of squares value is improving as we go down here, but it's very, very diminishing returns. So that might mean that as we're creating, this is our number of clusters here on our x-axis, where we have 2 clusters here, 3 clusters here, 4, 5, 6 as we're creating more and more clusters, our within cluster sum of squares is getting smaller. So our values are getting tighter and tighter. Our clusters are getting closer and closer together, becoming more related to each other. However, there's a question of, are we really piecemealing that too small? Are we getting diminishing returns there? So this point here, this elbow point, is typically suggested as the reasonable number of clusters. So 3 would be considered reasonable for this. Arguments, of course, could be made for 4 and 5, etc. But and sometimes it's not quite as obvious or as useful as this example method is, but this is the elbow method nonetheless. Here is how you implement this in code. So here we have some data. We're just going to make some fake data here, and if we run sklearn clustering on this is what this we run k-means. This is what the grouping of data might look like. And this is the visualization that I actually used here in our elbow method was from this data. So even without the centroids assigned here, we can see that it does make sense for this data to be represented in 3 clusters, in 3 groups. So here we are. Here is the code for actually building the elbow method here, and this is the exact visualization we were looking at in the slide deck just a moment ago. And that notebook is under this week's class section. Silhouette score is another measurement of how similar data points are to its own cluster comparatively to how similar data points are in other clusters. And the idea is that higher scores indicate perhaps better clusters. And an interesting visual here is a couple different variations on unsupervised learning methods. So we just, in this data set, we just looked at k-means clustering. And this is how k-means clustering would separate this data given 3 clusters, and perhaps the elbow method determine the number of clusters. So a fairly high silhouette score of 0.637, and it looks reasonable. I think an argument could be made that looks reasonable and makes sense from a clustering standpoint. Single link looks much less reasonable visually, and you can see that the silhouette score reflects that. Very, very low, in fact, negative value here for that silhouette score. Complete link making decently similar representations to k-means and having a fairly similar silhouette score here. The highest score coming in here for Ward with a very different representation of clustering than k-means, and dbScan, which we talked about a little earlier, identifying a very small segment of a cluster here and a cluster here, and mixed models here with a silhouette score just below that of k-means. So I think a takeaway from this is that our unsupervised learning methods are really open to interpretation in terms of how we group these variables together. There is no predefined strong outcome that, yes, this is for sure the right and correct and only grouping of these customers that we could ever do. And cluster 1 is the perfect representation of these customers. We can see that as we apply different methods, we will get different representations. And as we choose different numbers of clusters, these individuals are grouped in very different ways. So having an individual lean in from a business perspective, understanding how this is going to be used, what the application of these clusters are, and how you can group them in the most meaningful way to achieve that outcome can be very helpful. So that's one piece to understand. And the second one is the silhouette score here, and how it measures these values for grouping, and that it can be a way of assessing the performance of the quote unquote performance of your unsupervised learning method, though there's really no ground truth to compare to. This is just saying how similar each cluster is to each other. So of course we have well separated clusters that are of similar, the distance of these points to each other is very similar to the distance of these points in the other clusters. Okay, so we talked about silhouette score. We talked about within cluster sum of squares, and we talked about how domain knowledge is really probably your best approach to assessing the performance of your k-means clustering. Of course, there's a lot of advantages to k-means clustering. It's very quick, it's very efficient. Calculating the distance from one point to another is something that computers do very, very well. It's easy to interpret and very easy to explain to stakeholders, and it scales well to higher dimensional pieces of data. If we add 3 features and 10,000 features, computationally, it scales fairly well. Of course, choosing the value for k is not always easy. It's sensitive to randomness in initialization of those clusters. It's sensitive to the number of clusters. There's, of course, no ground truth. And k-means clustering will always do spherical clusters because we're doing distance calculation to a centroid point. So you're always going to have spherical clusters as opposed to density clusters. And so we talked about a lot of real world implementations. We talked about document grouping. We talked about fraud detection. We talked about image compression and customer segmentation. I think that is it for today. Here's the code on the PCA visualization as well. This was a fairly quick session. I'm going to pause the recording here and then ask if there are any questions.